The vote to banish Earth from the Concord of Settled Stars passed by a margin of 411 to 1, and the 1 was a clerical error nobody bothered to correct. For 900 years, the Concord had governed the lanes between 40,000 worlds, and in all that time, it had never once cast a member out. It expelled the humans on a gray afternoon, in a chamber of pale stone, with a speech that lasted 6 minutes, and a seal that took less than a second to stamp. The Speaker of the Settled Stars did not even rise from his seat to deliver it. The charge was simple. Humanity, the Concord ruled, was unfit to sit among civilized peoples. They were too young, too loud, too willing to fight when older species would have bowed. Their world was a backwater. Their fleet was a rumor. Their seat in the great chamber had been an act of charity. And charity, the speaker reminded the room, was a thing the Concord could withdraw whenever it pleased. So it withdrew. The human delegate was given one rotation to leave the chamber. Her name was Edra Vance, and she did not argue, and she did not weep, and that, more than anything, was what the watching species remembered later. She stood. She gathered the small case she had carried into every session for 11 years. She walked the length of the chamber under the eyes of 400 delegations, and at the door she turned, just once, and spoke 7 words into the silence. "We will remember which of you smiled." Then she was gone, and the chamber laughed, and the matter was considered closed. The laughter was not cruel, exactly. That was the part the humans never forgot and never forgave. It was worse than cruel. It was careless. The delegations laughed the way you laugh, when a small thing trips and falls, and is of no consequence. The easy laugh of people who have already moved on to the next item on the agenda. There were 311 votes still to be taken that afternoon. The matter of Earth had taken 6 minutes. 6 minutes to end a species' place among the stars, and not one of the 400 delegations thought the species worth a 7th. A young Vorn aide, present that day in the gallery, would write home that the human delegate had walked out very straight, and that it had been strange, because the doomed usually did not walk straight. The doomed begged, or wept, or threatened. This one had walked the length of the chamber as though she were measuring it for something, and the aide could not say what, and the not knowing stayed with him for the rest of his short and unremarkable life. She had been measuring it for something. The humans, it turned out, measured everything. They were a species of shipwrights and surveyors and people who counted, and they had been counting that chamber all 11 years they sat in it, and they would have a use for the measurements one day, but that day was 80 years off, and on the gray afternoon, there was only the laughter and the seal, and the next item on the agenda. It was not closed. It had only been moved somewhere the Concord could not see. You should understand who did the laughing, because they are the ones this story happens to. The loudest were the Cullhouses of the Vorn ascendancy. The Vorn were hunters by law and by appetite, an old and patient people who had built an entire civilization on a single clean idea, which was that some species existed to be governed and some existed to be harvested, and the only crime in the universe was confusing the two. For 3,000 years, the Vorn had held the contracts. When a world grew troublesome, when a colony refused a tithe, when a species multiplied past the number the Concord found tidy, the Concord did not dirty its own hands. It signed a writ, and the writ went to the Cullhouses, and the Cullhouses sent their long gray ships, and the trouble ended. 90 billion lives across 2,000 years had ended under Vorn writs. The Concord called it population correction. The Vorn called it work. The dead called it nothing, because the dead do not get a chamber and a seal and a 6-minute speech. The Vorn had wanted the human writ for a long time. Earth was rich. The lanes near it were rich. And the humans had a stubborn way of saying no that made for excellent hunting. A species that fought, the Cullhouses had learned across 3,000 years, scattered in interesting patterns, and could be harvested slowly, world by world, for generations. A species that bowed, was harvested once, and was boring. The Vorn did not like boring. They had filed petitions for the human writ 4 separate times across the 11 years Earth held its seat, and 4 times the Concord had declined, not out of any love for the humans, but because expelling a sitting member was a thing the Concord had simply never done and did not wish to be the first to do. The banishment changed all of that, and the Cullhouses had pushed hard for it, precisely because it would. A banished species was not a member. A banished species was just territory that had not yet been processed. When the vote passed, the senior Cullmaster, a Vorn called HFY, leaned to the delegate beside him and said the thing that would later be carved, in human hands, into a wall on a world HFY had never heard of. He said, "A banished people builds nothing, they only run." He was wrong in a way that would take 80 years to teach him, and the teaching would be thorough. Earth ran, at first. That part was true. The colony tenders and the seed haulers and the long, slow arc frames pulled back from the inner lanes and went dark, one by one, until the maps the Concord kept showed a clean, empty space where a young species used to be. The Vorn marked it as abandoned territory. The Concord marked it as resolved. The galaxy, which had a short memory and a long list of more interesting things, forgot. But running is just moving with a destination you have not announced yet. The humans did not scatter into the dark like frightened birds. They went to one place, a place no chart named, a dead binary system at the edge of a dust wall, where two burnt-out stars circled each other in the cold. There was nothing there worth taking, which was exactly why they took it. The Vorn surveys had passed it over 3,000 years before and marked it with a single word that meant, roughly, empty, and never looked at it again, because the Vorn looked at worlds that had things on them, and a dead binary behind 11 light-years of debris had nothing on it at all. The humans had found it by accident, decades before the banishment, when a survey crew lost its bearings in the dust and stumbled out the far side into the quiet between two corpse stars and found a thing the Vorn charts had missed. The dust wall was not solid. It had a current in it, a thin, braided lane of clear space that wound through the debris like a thread through wool, and a ship that knew the thread could pass. The survey crew had logged it, quietly, in the way humans logged things they thought might matter one day, and the log had sat in an Earth archive for 30 years doing nothing. On the gray afternoon, it stopped doing nothing. They called the dead system the Forge, because that is what they intended it to become, and they began to build. Not a fleet. Not at first. First they built the thing that builds fleets. The woman who built it was named Tamsin Crow, and she had been a shipwright on Earth before the banishment, which in the old order meant she was a person of no importance at all. Shipwrights did not get seats. Shipwrights did not get votes. Shipwrights stood in cold yards with cold hands and made the things that other, better people then commanded. Tamsin Crow had spent 30 years making hulls she was never allowed to name. At the Forge, she named everything. She was 61 years old when the first keel was laid, and she would be 141 before the empire she started was finished, because humans at the Forge learned to live a very long time, and Tamsin Crow intended to see all of it. She had been in the gallery on the gray afternoon. She had not had a seat, of course. Shipwrights did not get seats. She had stood at the back rail of the gallery, behind the proper people, behind the delegations and the aides and the recorders, in the place where the laborers stood, and from there she had heard the laughing very clearly, because laughter carries up. She had watched Edra Vance walk out under 400 sets of eyes, and she had decided, standing there with her useless shipwright's hands gripping the cold rail, that she would spend the rest of her life making sure the laughing stopped. It was not a dramatic decision. Tamsin Crow did not do dramatic. It was the decision of a maker who has just seen a thing built badly, a thing that will fail, a thing whose failure she can already predict, because she has spent her life watching what holds and what does not. The Concord had built its order on contempt, and contempt is a poor material, brittle and proud, and Tamsin Crow had looked at it across that chamber and seen, with the cold, clear eye of someone who knows hulls, exactly where it would crack. She had simply decided, that afternoon, to be the thing that pressed on the crack. She told no one for a long time. You do not announce a thing like that. You build it. It would take 80 years. She did not mind. Hunters, she liked to say, are patient. So are the people who get tired of being hunted. The Forge grew the way coral grows, slow and silent and impossible to stop. In the first decade, it was a single ring of yards around the dead stars, and the humans inside it lived hard and bred careful and learned to make air out of stone. They had come with very little. The banishment had given them one rotation to leave the chamber, and a few years, no more, before the lanes closed to them entirely, and what they carried into the dark was not weapons or wealth, but knowledge, the contents of Earth's archives, the long, patient accumulation of a young species that wrote everything down. They could not bring an army. They brought the instructions for one, and the people who could read them, and the stubbornness to spend 80 years on the reading. The first winters at the forge killed many. There is no kind way to say it, and the Aldgate worlds never tried to say it kindly. A dead binary is cold past the meaning of the word, and stone yields its air and water slowly, and only to those who know exactly how to ask. The first generation buried more than it raised. But it raised some, and it taught them, and the teaching was the thing that mattered. Because a hull can be rebuilt, but the knowledge of how to bend dust into a lane, and stone into a hull, and contempt into patience, that has to be passed hand to hand, and the first generation passed it, dying, into the second. In the second decade it was 100 rings, and the first ships came off the ways, small and ugly and strong. They were not warships yet. They were tenders and haulers, and the slow machines that build the machines that build, the unglamorous foundation of everything that would come. Tamsin Crow oversaw the building of the builders, because she understood, as the council came to understand, that the fleet was not the goal. The fleet was the last thing you made. First you made the thing that makes fleets, and that took 30 years, and the Vorn spent those 30 years culling grain worlds and never once looked behind the wall. In the third decade, the dead system had a name in human mouths that no Concord chart would carry for 40 more years, and the name was Aldgate, and Aldgate had 1,000,000 souls in it, and not one of them had ever bowed to a settled star. The Vorn did not notice. The Vorn were busy. There were always more writs, always more troublesome worlds, always more harvests to bring in. They culled a colony called Issen for refusing a grain tithe and took 11 million in a single afternoon. They culled the moons of Tarek for breeding past quota. They culled, and the Concord signed, and the long gray ships came home heavy, and nobody at all watched the dead binary at the edge of the dust wall, where 100 rings had become 1,000. This is the blindness that ends every power that harvests, and the Vorn had it in full. People that takes does not study what it takes from. It does not need to. The grain does not have to be understood, only reaped. So the Vorn knew nothing of the humans beyond the few facts that mattered to a harvester, that they were young, that they fought, that they had been banished and had run. They did not know that the humans wrote everything down. They did not know that a banished species carries its whole self in its archives and can rebuild from them the way a cutting rebuilds a garden. They did not know that the survey crew had found the thread through the dust wall 30 years before, or that the thread led to a dead binary, or that a dead binary is the perfect place to build a thing you do not want seen, because no one looks at the dead. The Vorn knew none of it, because knowing it would have required curiosity, and a harvester has no curiosity, only appetite. Appetite looks at a thing and asks only one question, which is whether it can be eaten. The humans, behind their wall, were asking a different question about the Vorn, 1,000 different questions, year after year, and the asking was the difference between the two peoples, and it was the difference that built the empire. The Vorn had 100 years of harvest records on the humans, a few lines each, tonnage and quota and writ. The humans had 80 years of study on the Vorn so complete that the Aldgate engineers could have told you the failure threshold of a Vorn cull beam to 3 decimal places, and did, in the specifications of every hull they built. This is the part the Vorn would have wanted you to skip, the long, quiet part where nothing burns. But you cannot understand what came later without it. An empire is not the moment the guns fire. An empire is the 80 years before, the patience, the cold hands in the cold yards, the keels laid one after another, by people who had been told they were nothing and had decided to disagree at industrial scale. By the time the Vorn finally looked at the dust wall, the answer was already built. It had been built for years. It was simply waiting for a reason, and the Vorn, being hunters, would be the ones to provide it. The reason had a name too. Her name was Sella Iden. She was 9 years old, and she lived on a far colony called Wend, and she had never heard of the Concord, or the Forge, or a shipwright named Tamsin Crow. She only knew that one morning, the sky over Wend filled with long gray ships, and that her mother told her to run, and that the running, this time, would not be enough. The Vorn had drawn up a new writ. The colony of Wend had grown past quota. And Wend, though the Vorn did not know it yet, was flying a human flag. The colony of Wend sat on a green world at the end of a thin lane, 8,000 souls who grew long-stalked grain, and asked nothing of anyone. They had taken the human flag 4 years earlier, when a small, unmarked ship had drifted into their orbit and offered them a thing the Concorde had never offered, which was a promise that if the long gray ships ever came, someone would come too. The Wend farmers had not entirely believed it. A promise is cheap, and the dark is large, and everyone who lives at the end of a thin lane learns early that no one is coming. But the unmarked ship had left them a single gray stone the size of a fist, and told them that if the worst day arrived, they were to set the stone in the open and break it, and then they were to do nothing else but live as long as they could. For 4 years, the gray stone had sat on a shelf in the Wen meeting hall, and the farmers had grown used to it the way you grow used to a thing you do not expect to need. Children had asked about it. Orla Pike had told them the truth, which was that it was a promise, and that promises were heavy things and should not be broken lightly, and that she hoped to die of old age without ever lifting the hammer. The children had nodded the way children nod at things too large to hold, and gone back to the grain, and the stone had gathered the thin dust of 4 quiet years. There had been arguments, in those 4 years, about whether to keep it at all. Some of the careful ones said that flying a human flag was an invitation to exactly the kind of attention a small world could not survive. The humans were banished after all, and the Concorde hated them. To take their flag was to paint a target on a green world that had never harmed anyone. That was the argument, and it was a good one, and Orla Pike had listened to it patiently every year at the Planting Council, and had voted, every year, to keep the stone. She could not have told you exactly why. Something in the way the unmarked ship's crew had spoken, 4 years before. They had not promised victory. They had not promised safety. They had promised only that someone would come, and come too late was still come, and Orla Pike had lived long enough to know that the difference between a world that someone comes for and a world that no one comes for is the whole difference between the two kinds of dying. She kept the stone. So when the sky filled with long gray ships, the Wend headwoman did 2 things. She told the colony to scatter into the deep grain where the harvesters could not easily count them, and she walked out into the open square, alone, and she set the gray stone on the flat warm stone of the well, and she broke it with a hammer. It did not flash. It did not scream. It simply cracked, and a thin, cold light leaked out of it and went up into the sky, and was gone, faster than thought, faster than the eye could follow, a single thread of light running up the thin lane toward a dead binary system 11 hours away, at the speed the Vorn understood, and no time at all, at the speed the humans had learned. Then Orla Pike sat down on the lip of the well, and folded her hands, and waited to find out whether a promise was worth anything. You were there, in a sense. You were the Vorn. You should be made to see what you saw and what you did not see, because the not seeing is the whole of it. The cull-master of the Wend writ was named Drev Sewell, and he was bored. Wend was a small contract, 8,000 souls, barely worth the fuel. He had drawn it because it was on his lane, and the Concorde paid by the world, not by the head. He brought 12 ships, which was 11 more than he needed, because the Vorn did not hunt with restraint, and never had. Restraint was for the governed. Drev Sewell was a governor. He watched the colony scatter into the grain, and was unbothered. They always ran. Running only spread the harvest out, made it last, made it pleasant. He watched a single old farmer walk into the open square and break a rock, and he laughed, because that was the kind of thing the doomed did. Small rituals against the inevitable, and the Vorn had 1,000 years of folklore about the strange little gestures of species at the end. He logged it as superstition. He gave the order to begin the count. He was a careful enough hunter, by Vorn standards. He had run this kind of writ 200 times across a long life, and he had a method, and the method worked. You came in high, you let them scatter, you mapped the scatter from orbit, and then you brought the cull beams down in a slow grid that left nowhere to hide and nothing to harvest twice. It was unhurried work. The Vorn took pride in being unhurried. Panic was for the prey. The hunter had all the time in the world, because the prey could not leave, and the hunter could. Drev Sewell's gunners had the grid half-mapped. His logisticians were already calculating the tonnage, because the Concorde paid by the world, but the cull houses kept careful internal records of yield, and a tidy harvest was a point of professional honor. 8,000 souls was a modest number, but Drev Sewell intended to bring in a clean 98% of it, which would look well in his record, which was the only thing a cull master truly owned. He was, in the small gray way of his kind, content. His ships were lowering toward the grain when the dust wall opened. You have to understand that nothing comes out of the dust wall. It is 11 light years of cold debris, the corpse of a star that died before the Concorde had a name, and no lane runs through it, and no ship is built that can. The Vorn knew this the way they knew their own anatomy. So when the wall opened, when it simply parted like a curtain over a window no one knew was there, Drev Sewell's first thought was not fear. It was confusion. It was the specific confusion of a creature whose map has just been proven a lie. Through the gap came the first ships of the Aldgate fleet, and they were not small, and they were not ugly, and they were not few. The lead ship alone was 4 kilometers from bow to stern, a long dark wedge, with no markings the Vorn could read, and no lines the Vorn had ever seen, and it came through the wall at a speed the Vorn instruments refused to render, so that one moment it was a smudge at the edge of the gap, and the next it was simply there, filling the sky over Wend, blotting out the thin morning sun. Behind it came 9 more of its size. Behind those came 40 smaller. Behind those came a number Drev Sewell's gunner started to count and then stopped counting, because the counting was not helping and the number was still growing. There is a specific quality to the silence aboard a hunter's ship when the prey turns out to be larger than the hunter. Drev Sewell had heard about it, in the old stories the cull houses told, the rare and shameful accounts of harvests that went wrong, of writs that turned in the hand. He had never lived it. He lived it now. His bridge, which a moment before had been the unhurried clockwork of professionals about their craft, went very quiet, and in the quiet, you could hear the instruments themselves seeming to hesitate, refusing the numbers, recalculating, refusing again. The human ships did not look like Concorde ships. That was the first thing the bridge registered, before the size, before the number. Concorde ships, even Vorn ships, even the oldest hulls in the harvest fleets, were built to a grammar 3,000 years old, a shared language of plates and ports, and the particular way a civilization that had grown up together made its machines. These ships spoke no part of that grammar. They had been designed in isolation, in the dark, by minds that owed nothing to the Concorde's 3,000 years, and the strangeness of them was not decoration, it was a message. It said plainly, in lines the Vorn could feel but not read, "We did not learn this from you. We learned it ourselves, while you were not watching." This was the part the Vorn had told themselves could never happen. A banished people builds nothing, they only run. And here was a banished people that had built, in the dark, in the silence, in the 80 years the Vorn had spent culling grain colonies, a fleet that came through a wall the universe said had no door. The lead ship spoke. It did not hail in the polite cadence of the Concorde. It spoke plainly, in the common tongue, on every band at once, in a voice that was calm the way deep water is calm. "This is the Aldgate ship long account. You are conducting an unauthorized cull on a protected world. You will withdraw your ships and surrender your writ. You have until I finish speaking. I am finished." Drev Sewell did not withdraw. Hunters do not withdraw. He gave the order to fire on the green world below, because if he could not have the harvest cleanly, he would at least deny it, and the Vorn always denied what they could not keep. The long account had anticipated this. It had been built by a people who knew exactly how a hunter thinks, because they had spent 80 years being the hunted, and had learned the shape of the thing chasing them better than the thing knew itself. Before Drev Sewell's order reached his gunners, the long account had already done the one thing the Vorn had no defense against, because it had never needed one. It put itself between the gray ships and the world. 4 kilometers of human hull dropped into low orbit over Wend, directly above the scattered grain, and Drev Sewell's first volley, the volley meant for 8,000 farmers, struck the long account instead. The Vorn cull beams were old and proven, designed to strip atmosphere off a colony in a single pass, and they hit the human ship full across the dorsal line, and the human ship did not flinch. You should sit with that. The beams that had ended 11 million on Isen, that had cracked the moons of Tarak, struck the long account and ran off it like rain off a stone roof. The hull was something the humans had made at the forge across 80 years, layered and grown and folded, and it had been tested against worse than anything the Vorn carried, because the humans had spent a generation imagining exactly this moment and building the answer to it before the question arrived. The Aldgate worlds had not built their hulls by guessing. This is the thing the Vorn never understood and could never have understood. Because the Vorn did not study their prey, they only ate it. The humans had spent 80 years studying the Vorn. They had recovered cull beam burns from 100 dead worlds, scraped the residue, measured the wavelengths, modeled the exact mechanism by which the long gray ships unmade the living. They had built, at the forge, a chamber whose only purpose was to fire reconstructions of the Vorn cull beam at sample after sample of hull, 10,000 times, 100,000, refining the layering each time, until they had a skin of grown metal that did not merely resist the beam, but seemed not to notice it. They had been firing the Vorn's own weapon at their own ships for 60 years before a single Vorn fired it at them for real. So when Drev Sul's volley struck the long account, it struck a hull that had already survived that exact volley 100,000 times in a cold chamber behind a dust wall. The ship was not surprised. The ship had been built by people who refused, on principle, to ever be surprised by the thing that had killed their friends. The beam was an old, well-studied, thoroughly defeated problem, and the long account wore it the way a stone wears weather, with the patience of something that has seen this exact rain before and knows precisely how little it means. The long account held its position over the grain and let the Vorn empty themselves against it. 12 ships fired everything they had. The green world below never felt a single beam. Orla Pike, sitting on the lip of the well, watched the sky burn against a dark hull that would not let the burning through, and she understood, with the slow wonder of someone who has just learned the universe contains a thing she did not believe in, that the promise had been worth something after all. When the Vorn volleys guttered out, the long account spoke once more. "You have spent your writ on my hull. It is a good hull. Now I am going to show you what the writ bought." What it bought was not a slaughter. This is important, and the Vorn would never fully understand it, which was itself part of the lesson. The Aldgate fleet did not come to kill 12 ships. 12 ships were nothing. The humans had built an empire in the dark, and they did not measure their answers in 12. They came to take the writ away, all of it, forever. A writ, to the Concord, was not a piece of paper. It was a permission, the oldest and most absolute permission the Order possessed, the permission to decide that a population had grown inconvenient and to remove it. Every harvest in 3,000 years had flowed from a writ. The writ was the throat through which the whole machine of correction breathed, and the Aldgate worlds had decided, in the long dark, that you did not fight a machine like that by destroying its ships. Ships could be rebuilt. You fought it by reaching down its throat and taking the permission itself, by making the writ a thing that could be refused, and the only way to make a writ refusable was to be standing over it, in force, with a hull the machine could not scratch, saying no. That was what the Aldgate fleet was. It was the physical 4-kilometer-long shape of the word no, delivered to a green world at the end of a thin lane, and it had come to say that word over Wend, and mean it so thoroughly that the meaning would carry all the way back to the chamber of pale stone. The 40 smaller human ships moved first, and they moved the way a closing hand moves, without haste and without any gap to slip through. They surrounded the 12 gray ships, and they did not fire, and the not firing was somehow worse than fire, because it said you are not worth the shot. The Vorn tried to fold away, to run the lane back to the Concord in the safety of numbers, and found that the lane was gone. The humans had closed it. The same trick that had hidden a fleet behind a dust wall for 80 years could fold a lane shut as easily as it could fold one open, and Drev Sul, who had spent his life closing escapes on others, learned in one cold instant what it was to be on the inside of a closing hand. The long account spoke to him directly then, on a private band, and what it said was not a threat, it was a sentence, in the legal sense, read out plain. Cullmaster Drev Sul, by the law of the Aldgate worlds, which you have never heard of and are about to learn, the practice of the writ is ended. You will be returned to the Concord. You will carry a message. You will tell them that Wend is protected, that the 11,000 worlds behind this wall are protected, and that the next ship that comes to harvest a human flag will not be sent home to tell anyone anything. Do you understand? Drev Sewell understood that he was still alive, which surprised him, because in his place, he would not have left a witness. He did not yet understand that the witness was the weapon. The humans had learned, in 80 years of being forgotten, exactly how much power lived in a story that came home and would not stop being told. They let him go. They opened a single thread in the closed lane, just wide enough for one battered gray ship, and they sent Drev Sewell back toward the Concorde with his guns spent and his writ void, and a recording in his hold that he would have given anything to delete and could not. The recording was the human idea, and it was a cold one. The Aldgate worlds knew a defeated hunter would lie. He would come home and say he had been ambushed by an overwhelming force, by impossible numbers, anything to make his failure a matter of bad odds rather than bad premises. So the humans did not trust the telling to Drev Sewell. They placed the recording in his hold themselves, locked behind cryptography he could not break, set to play only in the chamber of the cull houses, before witnesses, on a band the whole Concorde could hear. It showed 12 ships emptying themselves against a hull that did not flinch. It showed, most of all, the moment the human ship chose not to kill, because that was the part Drev Sewell would most want to hide, and the part the humans most wanted shown. The other 11 ships they took intact, crews and all, down to Aldgate, where the crews would spend the rest of their lives learning what a harvested world felt like from the inside. Not as slaves, because the humans did not keep slaves, but as witnesses, which was worse, because a witness has to understand. On the green world below, the grain stopped trembling. The Wend came up out of the deep rows one by one, 8,000 farmers who had set a stone and broken it, and somehow, impossibly, lived. Orla Pike stood up from the well, and she looked at the dark hull filling her sky, and she did the only thing a farmer knows how to do with a debt that large. She started, quietly, to plan the next harvest, because the harvest would happen now, because someone had come. The long account did not leave for 3 days. It hung over Wend like a held breath, and small craft came down from it, and the humans walked among the farmers, and asked what they needed, and meant the question. Orla Pike met them in the square by the broken stone, and she did not know what to say to people who had just turned a slaughter into a quiet afternoon, and so she offered them the only thing a farmer has to offer, which was food, and they accepted it, and they sat at the long tables in the meeting hall and ate Wend grain, and asked the farmers about the soil and the weather and the harvest, and it was, Orla Pike said afterward, the strangest gratitude she had ever felt, to be asked about her ordinary life by the people who had just saved it, as though the ordinary life were the point, as though it had been the point all along. That was the thing the humans understood that the Concorde never had. The grain was the point, not the fleet, not the writ, not the order of the settled stars. The 8,000 farmers and their long-stalked grain and their quiet afternoons. The fleet existed only so that the grain could keep being the point. Strip away everything else, and that was the whole of the Aldgate idea. And a Vorn could have studied it for 1,000 years and never found it, because a Vorn looked at a green world and saw tonnage, and a human looked at a green world and saw a reason. They left the colony stronger than they found it, which is a thing harvesters never do, because harvesters take, and the Aldgate worlds had learned, in the long dark, that the only thing worth building an empire on was the opposite of taking. They left seed and tools and a second gray stone, larger than the first, and they told Orla Pike that she would not need it, but that no one should ever have to wonder whether someone would come. Then the fleet folded back through the dust wall and was gone, and the wall closed behind it, and Wend was alone again under its thin sun. But it was a different kind of alone now. It was the alone of a world that knows, for certain, that it is watched by something that will come. Drev Sewell reached the Concorde 11 days later. He was the first Vorn in 3,000 years to come home from a hunt with nothing in his holds and a message in his mouth, and the journey home was the longest of his life, because a hunter who returns empty has nothing to think about but the emptiness. He had tried, in those 11 days, to build the lie he would tell. It was the natural thing, the Vorn thing. He would say he had been ambushed. He would say the numbers had been impossible. the trap perfect, the force overwhelming, that no Cullmaster could have foreseen it, that the failure was the Concord's for not warning him. He rehearsed it across 11 days in the dark, and it was a good lie, and it would have worked, and he could not use it, because the recording in his hold could not be broken, and would play itself in the chamber whether he willed it or not, and the recording told the truth, and the truth was so much worse than the lie, that Drev Sewell spent the last days of the journey simply staring at the closed lane behind him, where a green world he had failed to harvest was being watched over by a power he could not name. When he played the recording for the Cull houses, the chamber that had laughed at Edra Vance 80 years before did not laugh. They watched 12 ships empty themselves against a hull that did not flinch. They watched a lane close where no lane could close. They watched the human ship choose, on a private band, not to kill, and they did not understand the choosing. And the not understanding was the beginning of the fear, because you can fight a thing you understand, and you cannot fight a thing that does what makes no sense by your own laws. For the first time in its 900-year history, the Concord of Settled Stars was afraid of something it had thrown away, and the thing it did not yet know, the thing that would take a second fleet and a third to teach it, was that the fear was correct, and that it was already far too late, and that 80 years ago, when the seal took less than a second to stamp, the Concord had not ended a species. It had only chosen the manner of its own undoing, and signed it, and laughed, and moved on to the next item on the agenda. The Concord did what frightened powers always do. It met, and it argued, and it decided that the thing it had seen could not be allowed to be true. A fleet of 10 human ships could not exist, the speaker said, because a banished backwater could not have built it. The dust wall could not open, the surveyor general said, because the charts said so, and the charts were the charts. The writ could not simply be ended by people with no seat and no vote, the Cull houses said, because the writ was the oldest law there was. So they ruled that Drev Sewell had been deceived. They ruled that the Green World's defender was a trick, a single ship and a clever projection, the desperate bluff of a dying people. They ruled, in short, that nothing had happened, and to prove that nothing had happened, they sent 100 ships to Wend to finish the cull that Drev Sewell had failed to complete. 100 ships. The Concord did not do things by halves once its pride was involved. The Vorn Cull houses assembled the largest harvest fleet in 200 years, and they put it under their most senior Cullmaster, the one who had laughed beside the human delegate 80 years before, the one who had said a banished people builds nothing. Hask Vorel was old now, very old, but the Vorn lived long and held grudges longer, and he took the Wend writ personally, because a human ship had made the Concord afraid, and Hask Vorel did not believe in being afraid of food. He had watched the recording, with the stillness of a creature who has decided in advance that he will not be moved. He had watched 12 ships empty themselves against a hull that did not flinch. He had watched the human ship choose, on a private band, not to kill Drev Sewell, and he had read that choice not as mercy, but as weakness, because to a Vorn, there was no difference between the two. A hunter who spares is a hunter who has lost the appetite, and a hunter who has lost the appetite is finished. Hask Vorel had decided that the humans were soft, that the whole display was the bluff of a people who could build a frightening hull but could not bring themselves to use it, and that 100 ships under a Cullmaster, who had no such softness, would call the bluff and end it. It was, in fairness to Hask Vorel, a coherent theory. It was even partly true. The humans could not bring themselves to harvest. That part he had read correctly. He had simply drawn the wrong conclusion from it, because he could not imagine that a refusal to harvest might be a strength rather than a lack. His whole civilization rested on the equation of mercy with weakness. And the equation had served the Vorn for 3,000 years, and Hask Vorel was not going to abandon it now, at the end of his long life, on the evidence of one recording. He took the 100 ships up the thin lane to Wend, certain, the way only the very old and the very proud can be certain, that he was bringing a hunting fleet to a soft and frightened people who would break the moment a real predator arrived. He found the green world quiet and undefended, and he was satisfied, because this was what the charts had promised, and Hask Vorel trusted the charts. He gave the order to begin the cull. The dust wall opened. You were there again. You were Hask Vorel this time, 3,000 years of certainty in a long gray body, watching the impossible curtain part for the second time in the Concorde's recorded history. And what came through was not 10 ships. The first lesson had been 10 ships, because 10 was enough to teach a fool. The second lesson was for a wiser fool, and it was larger. Through the wall came 100 Aldgate hulls, then 200, then 4. The number did not stop where HFY's instruments wanted it to stop. The humans had spent 80 years building, and they were not building toward a fleet. They were building toward the end of a question, and the question was whether a people the galaxy had thrown away could be safely ignored, and the Aldgate worlds were about to answer it at a scale that would echo for 1,000 years. The fleet that came through the wall was not the whole of the Aldgate strength. This is a thing the Vorn never learned, and the Concorde never believed, and it is true. Aldgate sent 300 hulls to Wend, and kept more than that at home, because a power built by people who had been surprised once does not empty itself for any single fight. The forge still ran. The yards still laid keels. The dead binary at the edge of the dust wall had become, across 80 years, the single greatest concentration of shipbuilding the galaxy had ever held, and it did not stop building merely because 100 gray ships had come up a lane. The 100 ships were a small matter to Aldgate. They were a writ to be voided, nothing more. The Aldgate worlds had built for a war against the whole Concorde, against the possibility that the entire order of the settled stars might one day come for them in force, and against that possibility 300 hulls was a patrol. HFY did not know this. He looked at 300 hulls and thought he was seeing everything the humans had, the way a man who finds a single track thinks he has found the whole of the animal. He was wrong about the scale the way he was wrong about everything, by assuming what he could see was the limit of what there was. At the head of the human armada came the long account, and beside it now came its sisters, 9 more 4-kilometer hulls, each with a name the Vorn would learn to dread, the tally kept, the debt recalled, the unforgiven lane, the 8th year of patience, the cold yard, the hand that held, the open door, the late witness, the long memory of small worlds. The Aldgate worlds named their warships the way they named everything, plainly and on purpose, and every name was a sentence, and every sentence was about a thing the Concorde had done and forgotten, and the humans had not. You could read the whole history of the banishment in the names of the human fleet, if you knew how. The debt recalled was the dead of Isin, the unforgiven lane was the moons of Tarak, the late witness was every world that had begged the Concorde for help, and received a writ instead. The humans did not name their ships for victories, because they had not had any victories yet when they built them. They named them for the wrongs they intended to answer, and they carried the names up the lane to Wend, the way a creditor carries an account that has come due. And at the head of them all, larger than any of the others, came a hull of 6 kilometers that the humans had finished only the year before, and had been waiting, with the patience of a people who had learned patience the hard way, for exactly this fleet to come up exactly this lane. Her name was Banished, and she carried the woman who had built her. Tamsin Crow was 141 years old. She had laid the first keel at the forge with cold hands 80 years before, and she had laid the last plate of the Banished herself, by tradition, by right, because she had named everything at Aldgate, and this was the last thing she would name. She had built an empire of 11,000 worlds from a dead binary at the edge of a dust wall, and she had told the Council of the Aldgate worlds that she wanted to be aboard when HFY came, because she had heard him laugh once and she intended to be the last thing he ever underestimated. She stood on the bridge of the Banished and watched the 100 gray ships arrange themselves over Wend, and she did not feel triumph, because triumph is for people who were not sure. She had been sure for 80 years. What she felt was something closer to the satisfaction of a maker watching a thing she built do exactly what she built it to do. The bridge of the Banished was not what a Vorn would have expected of a warship. It was quiet, and it was plain, and it was full of people who had grown up at the forge and had never known a sky that was not the cold light of 2 dead stars. They were the 3rd generation now, and the 4th, the children and grandchildren of the people who had buried their friends in the first winters. And they did not carry the banishment as a wound, the way Tamsin Crow did. They carried it as a fact, the way you carry the shape of the land you were born on. They had been raised inside the answer. They did not know how to be anything but the thing that comes when the long gray ships arrive. Tamsin Crow looked at them, her crew, the children of the dark, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was the real fleet. Not the hulls. The hulls were just metal. The fleet was these people, raised in the cold to be the opposite of harvesters, and the Vorn had no answer to them, because the Vorn had never imagined that a people could be built as deliberately as a ship, plate by plate, year by year, into something that simply would not break. She had set the last plate of the Banished herself, in vacuum, in cold past the meaning of the word, the kind of work that killed young people, and she 141. The council had argued against it. She had insisted, because a maker should close the thing she opens, and she had signed the plate underneath in the small plain letters she signed everything with. The Banished was hers, in a way no commander's ship is ever theirs, because she had not been given it. She had made it. She spoke to the fleet on a band the Vorn could not hear, and what she said was simple. No world burns today, not theirs either. We take the writ, not the lives. That is the whole of what makes us different from them, and the day we forget it is the day we become them. Hold to it. Then she opened a band the Vorn could hear, and she spoke to Hask Vorel directly, because she wanted him to know her voice. Cullmaster, 80 years ago you said a banished people builds nothing. I was in the gallery. I heard you. I have spent every day since building the thing that proves you wrong, and here it is, and it has your name in mind. You will not harvest this world. You will not harvest any world again. The cull houses are finished. You simply have not been told yet. Hask Vorel answered her the way the Vorn always answered, with the one idea their whole civilization rested on, the idea that some things govern, and some things are harvested, and the only crime is confusing the two. He told her that she had built a beautiful pyre. He told her that the Vorn had ended 90 billion lives, and would end 90 billion more, and that her fleet, however large, however clever, would join the long quiet list of species that thought they were the exception. He told her to look at his 100 ships, and understand that she was outnumbered, that her empire was a bluff with a long shadow, and that he was about to call it. He gave the order to fire. He gave it almost gratefully. The talk had unsettled him, the calm of her voice, the way she had said his name as though she had been carrying it for 80 years, which she had. A hunter does not like to be known by his prey. It reverses something fundamental. Hask Vorel wanted to get back to the part he understood, the part where the long gray ships fired and the trouble ended, and so he gave the order, with a kind of relief, as a man returns to familiar ground. 100 Vorn ships poured everything into the Aldgate fleet at once. It was the largest cull volley in the history of the Concord, enough firepower to strip the atmosphere off 40 worlds, and it broke across the human hulls in a tide of light that lit the green sky of Wend like a second dawn. And the human ships held. There is a moment, in the history of every power that thinks itself permanent, when the thing it believed impossible happens in front of it, and the believing and the seeing cannot both be kept, and one of them has to break. The Concord had built 3,000 years on a single belief, which was that the cull beam was the final argument, the weapon past which there was no appeal. Every world that had ever been corrected had been corrected by that belief made into light. It was the foundation under the foundation, so deep no one ever thought to question it, because to question it was to question why the Vorn were the Vorn, and the dead were the dead. And on a gray morning, over a green world, 200 human hulls took the largest application of that final argument in 200 years, and did not move. Something had to break, and it was not the human ships. This is the part the Vorn could not make their instruments accept, the part Hask Vorel would replay 10,000 times in the years he had left, and never come to terms with. The Aldgate hulls were not merely strong. They had been built by a people whose entire civilization was an answer to the cull beam, designed across 80 years by minds that had nothing to do all that time but imagine, in perfect detail, the weapon that had ended their friends, and engineer the thing that made it harmless. The 100-ship volley struck 200 human hulls and ran off them, and not one plate failed, and not one Aldgate ship so much as adjusted its position to absorb it. When the volley ended, the Aldgate fleet was exactly where it had been, in perfect formation, untouched, and the silence afterward was the loudest thing in the Concord's history. Tamsin Crow let the silence hold for a moment. She wanted Hask Vorel to spend everything first. A hunter who has emptied his guns and changed nothing is a hunter learning, for the first time, what his prey has always known. Then she gave the order, and the Aldgate fleet did the thing it had been built across 80 years to do. It closed the lane. Not one lane, every lane. The fold trick that had hidden a million souls behind a dust wall for a generation reached out across the whole region, and one by one the escape routes the Vorn had counted on simply stopped existing, folded shut by the largest application of human fold engineering ever attempted. Hundreds of ships working as one mind to seal 100 gray hulls into a pocket of space, with no door but the one the humans held. Hask-Vorel ordered the fold to safety. There was no safety. He ordered it again, louder, and the order went nowhere, because there was nowhere for it to go. 3,000 years of being the thing that closed the escape, and now the escape was closed on him, by people he had called food, and the irony of it was so complete that even Hask-Vorel, in the last clear part of his old mind, understood it. The fold trick was the heart of everything the Aldgate worlds had built, and it was the one thing the Vorn could never have copied, even if they had captured a ship and torn it apart, because it was not really a machine at all. It was a discipline. The humans had learned, in 80 years behind a wall, that space could be folded the way a shipwright folds metal, and that the folding required not power but precision, hundreds of minds working as one, each holding a tiny piece of an enormous shape, the way a choir holds a chord. The Vorn folded their ships one at a time, each hull punching its own crude hole. The humans folded space itself, in great deliberate sheets, and they could fold a lane open or shut across a whole region if there were enough of them, and there were enough of them. So when Hask-Vorel ordered the fold to safety, the humans simply held the cord, and the safety did not exist, and there was nothing his crews could do but pour more power into drives that had nowhere to take them. He had built his whole world on the line between the governing and the harvested, and he had just been moved, against his will, from one side of it to the other. What the Aldgate fleet did next was not a battle. The Vorn had brought a battle, the humans had brought an ending, and the two are not the same shape. The Banished moved forward through the closed pocket, 6 kilometers of dark hull, and the 100 gray ships fell back before it, the way grass falls before a slow wind, and there was nothing they could do about it, because there was nowhere to fall back to. Tamsin Crow did not fire. She had told the fleet that no world burned today, and no ship either, and she meant it, because the whole point of 80 years of building was to prove that strength did not require slaughter, that a people could be the most dangerous thing in the dark, and still choose not to be the worst. So instead of guns, the Aldgate fleet used the thing the Vorn had no defense against, which was choice. It is worth understanding why this was a weapon, because the Vorn never did. The cull houses ran on the certainty that there were two kinds of beings, the governing and the harvested, and that the line between them was fixed by strength. A Vorn crew did not think of itself as cruel, any more than a tide thinks of itself as cruel. They were simply on the strong side of a line the universe itself had drawn, and that was the whole of their moral universe, complete and closed, and 3,000 years old. The humans broke it not by being stronger, though they were, but by offering the one thing the line could not survive, which was a third option. The Vorn crews had spent their whole lives believing there were only two places to stand, and now a voice was telling them there was a third, that you could be strong and refuse to harvest, that the line was not the law of the universe but a choice the Vorn had made and kept making every single day, and that they, personally, each of them, could unmake it right now, in the next minute, by powering down a weapon. That is a terrible thing to offer a creature who has built its whole conscience on having no choice. It does not feel like mercy. It feels like the floor opening. The Banished opened every band at once, and Tamsin Crow spoke to the 100 crews, not to Hask-Vorel, to the crews, the gunners and the pilots, and the young Vorn who had signed onto a harvest fleet, because the cull houses paid well, and the work was easy, and nobody had ever told them it could go the other way. You have one chance to stop being what you are, she said. The cull houses are over. Your writ is void. Your beams have failed against us, and your lanes are closed, and you cannot win. And I am not interested in killing you, because I have spent my whole life refusing to be the thing that kills the helpless, and I am not going to start with you. Power down your weapons. Open your holds. You will be taken to Aldgate, and you will be treated as no harvested soul of yours was ever treated. And that, more than any beam, is the sentence I am passing on you. You will live in the mercy you never gave. Choose. Some of them chose. This is the part that mattered most to Tamsin Crow, and it is the part the Cull houses would never put in their records. 31 of the 100 gray ships powered down their weapons and opened their holds, young crews and old, who had looked at the thing the humans had built, and at the thing they themselves had spent their lives doing, and had decided, in one cold, clear moment, that they would rather be witnesses than harvesters. The first to power down was a small gray ship near the edge of the formation, a supply hull with a young crew, and the records the Aldgate worlds kept show that its captain was a Vorn of barely 40 cycles named Sesk, who had run 6 harvests and disliked all of them in a way he had never been allowed to say aloud. The Vorn did not have a word for the thing Sesk felt, because a people that does not permit a choice does not need a word for the wish to make one. He powered down his weapons 11 seconds after Tamsin Crow finished speaking, and when his crew looked at him, he said the only thing he could think of, which was, "She gave us a third one." They understood him. They had all felt the floor open too. After Sesk, the powering down spread the way a crack spreads through ice, ship by ship, each crew watching the one beside it, choose and finding, in the choosing of others, the permission to choose themselves. 31 ships in all. The humans took them gently, which is the only way the humans took anything by then, and folded them down toward Aldgate to begin the long work of learning what they had been. The other 69, under Hask Varel, chose the harvest one last time. Hask Varel could not surrender. It was not in him. 3,000 years of certainty does not bend, it only breaks. And Hask Varel ordered the 69 to fire on the Banished with everything they had left. A last cull volley at point-blank range, the desperate gesture of a hunter who would rather die a hunter than live as anything else. The volley struck the Banished full on the bow, the heaviest single blow ever delivered in the Concorde's history, and the green sky of Wend lit a third time, brighter than the two before. The Banished took it and came through it, and did not slow. Tamsin Crow watched her own hull shrug off the death of 90 billion souls worth of weaponry, and she felt the thing she had been building toward for 80 years settle into place. Not joy, not even satisfaction now, just the clean, still certainty of a maker whose work is finished and good. The Banished came on through the dying light, and it reached the heart of the Vorn formation, and there it stopped. And it did the one thing the Vorn had never once done to anyone. It gave them time. Time was the thing the harvest had never given. The harvested were never given a minute to think, because thinking is dangerous in the harvested. Thinking leads to the kind of refusal that had just unmade 31 ships. The Vorn doctrine was very clear on this point. You did not let the prey think. So when the Banished stopped in the center of the formation, and simply waited, guns cold, the remaining gray ships did not know what was happening to them, because it had never happened to anyone. They were being given time, and time, the humans had learned in 80 years of having nothing else, is the most dangerous gift there is. Tamsin Crow held the Banished motionless in the center of the 69 gray ships, guns cold, hold closed, and she let them look at her. She let them spend a full minute, then 2, then 5, looking at the thing that could end them, and was choosing, second by visible second, not to. It was the cruelest thing she could have done to a people who measured worth in the harvest, and it was also the kindest, and it was both at once on purpose, because Tamsin Crow had thought about this moment for 8 decades, and she had decided exactly what it would teach. You are not being harvested, she told them. You are not even being fought. You are being shown that you were never necessary. Everything you took because no one stopped you, and now someone has, and it cost us nothing. And that is the truth the Cull houses can never survive. You were not strong. You were only unopposed. There is a difference, and you are looking at it. She let that settle before she went on. The crews who would soon power down were listening to a thing no Vorn had ever been made to hear, which was an honest account of themselves, and it landed harder than any beam, because a beam ends you, and an honest account makes you live with what you have been. For 3,000 years, she told them, your people have called yourselves the strong. You harvested 90 billion souls, and called it the law of the universe. But you were never tested. Not once. You only ever pointed your beams at worlds that could not point anything back. That is not strength. A storm is not strong because it flattens a field. Strength is what happens when the field flattens back, and your field has flattened back. And look at what your strength is, now that it is opposed. It is 68 ships drifting in a closed pocket, waiting to be told what becomes of them. That was always all it was. You simply never met the day that showed you. Then she gave the 69 the same choice she had given the first 31, and this time, with the Banished motionless and merciful in the middle of them, with their last volley spent and shrugged off, with the whole impossible truth of the Aldgate Empire filling their screens, 68 of them powered down. The last one was HFY. He would not. He could not. He turned his ship, the oldest and largest of the gray hulls, and he drove it straight at the Banished at full power. Not to escape. Escape was gone, but to end the way he had lived, with a kill in front of him, even a kill he could not make. He emptied his last reserves into a ramming run at 6 kilometers of human hull, 3,000 years of the Vorn idea compressed into one long gray ship, choosing oblivion over understanding. The Banished did not move. It did not need to. The humans had built fold fields into the Banished that could close a lane across a whole region, and closing the space in front of one ramming ship was nothing to a hull like that. HFY's charge crossed the last kilometer and met a fold the humans set in his path, and his ship did not strike the Banished. It struck the place where space had been folded gently aside, and it slid past the great dark hull close enough to touch, and harmed it not at all, and came out the other side spent, drifting, dead in the water, every reserve gone, the last hunter of the cull houses powerless in the center of the empire he had said could never be built. Tamsin Crow could have ended him then. The fleet expected it. HFY expected it. Wanted it even. A clean kill to make him a martyr instead of a fool. She did not give it to him. There was a long moment, on the bridge of the Banished, when the crew waited to see what she would do, because they were the children of the dark, and they had been raised on the story of the laughing in the chamber, and some part of them, the human part, the part that was not yet finished being built, wanted the kill. Wend was below them. The dead of Isen were in the names of their ships. HFY had laughed 80 years ago and signed 90 billion souls into the void across his long life, and here he was, helpless, drifting, asking with everything but words to be ended. It would have been easy, it would have felt, for one bright moment, like justice. Tamsin Crow felt it too. She had wanted to end him for 80 years, and she did not, because the wanting was the exact thing the Vorn had built their whole civilization on, the appetite that made the line between the governing and the harvested feel like law, and the moment she fed it, she would be standing on the wrong side of her own life's work. The Vorn killed because they wanted to, and called it nature. If she killed because she wanted to, she would have proven HFY right about the deepest thing, which was that strength always becomes hunger in the end. So she did not feed it. She brought the Banished alongside his drifting ship, and she opened a private band, just the two of them, the way it had been 80 years ago in the gallery, when he had not even known she existed. You said a Banished people builds nothing, she told him. I want you to look out your window. That is what nothing builds. 11,000 worlds. A fleet your whole civilization cannot scratch. A mercy your kind has never once shown. I built it, and I started with cold hands in a cold yard the day you laughed, and I am the last thing you misjudged, and I am not going to kill you, because killing you would let you stop learning, and I want you to learn for a very long time. Then she took his ship intact, HFY and all, and folded him down toward Aldgate with the others, to live, as she had promised, inside the mercy he had never given. It was, the Aldgate worlds agreed afterward, the coldest thing Tamsin Crow ever did, and the most just, and the two were the same act. The captured crews were taken down to Aldgate and given a thing the Vorn had never given, which was the chance to become something other than what they had been. The Aldgate worlds did not imprison them. They housed them in the rings around the dead stars, among the children of the dark, and they put them to work, not harvest work, never harvest work, but the slow, honest work of building, of growing air from stone and metal from dust, of laying keels and tending grain in the great hollow farms that fed the forge. The Vorn had spent their whole lives taking. At Aldgate, they learned, hand by hand, how to make, and many of them found, to their own astonishment, that making was the thing they had been starving for all along, without a word for the hunger. Not all of them changed. Some of the older Vorn, whose certainty had set as hard as HFY's, never made the turn, and lived out their days at the forge as guests who would not be reconciled, and were allowed to, because the humans did not require the surrender of the soul, only the surrender of the harvest. But the young ones changed. Sesk, the captain who had powered down first, became in time a builder of some note, and his children were born under the cold light of 2 dead stars, and grew up not knowing how to harvest anything, and that, the Aldgate world said, was the only victory worth winning, the kind that ends not when the enemy dies, but when the enemy's grandchildren cannot imagine being the enemy. The 100 gray ships were gone, taken whole, not one life lost on either side. The largest harvest fleet in 200 years ended without a single death, which was a thing the Concorde's records had no category for, and never would. The dust wall had not opened on a slaughter. It had opened on a sentence, and the sentence was over, and the green world below had never felt a single beam. Above Wend, the Aldgate fleet held its formation in the quiet after, and Tamsin Crow stood on the bridge of the ship she had named, for the day they threw her people away, and she finally let herself feel the thing she had been holding back for 80 years. It was not vengeance. Vengeance was what HFY had wanted from her, and she had refused him even that. It was something older, and slower, and far more dangerous to an empire built on harvest. It was the satisfaction of having been right, and having proven it without becoming the thing that wronged her. The Aldgate worlds had been thrown into the dark to die, and they had not died, and they had not become hunters, and they had built, out of cold hands and patience and refusal, the one power in the galaxy that was strong enough to end the harvest, and decent enough not to start a new one. Now there was only the Concorde left to tell. The Concorde of settled stars learned what had happened at Wend the slow way, the way frightened powers always learn things, in fragments and denials, and finally in a silence too large to argue with. The 31 ships that had surrendered first did not come home. The 68 that surrendered second did not come home. HFY, the senior cullmaster, the oldest hunter the Vorn possessed, did not come home. A harvest fleet of 100 ships had gone up a thin lane to finish a small writ on a small green world, and the lane had simply swallowed it, and the dust wall the charts said had no door, had closed over all of them, and the Concorde, for the second time in 80 years, was afraid of something it had thrown away. This time the fear did not pass. The speaker of the settled stars called the great chamber into session, the same chamber of pale stone, where Edra Vance had walked out under 400 sets of eyes, where HFY had laughed, where the seal had taken less than a second to stamp. 400 delegations gathered, and they argued, and for the first time in 900 years, they could not agree on what was true, because the truth was a thing they had banished, and the banished thing had built an answer too large to deny. The argument in the chamber lasted 3 days, which was itself unprecedented, because the Concorde did not argue. It decreed. For 900 years the great chamber had been a place where the strong announced what was true, and the weak recorded it, and the announcing had always been swift, because there had never been anything strong enough to make it wait. Now there was. 100 ships had gone up a lane and not come back, and the not coming back was a fact too heavy for any decree to lift, and so for the first time, the 400 delegations sat in the pale stone room and discovered that they did not know what to do. The Cullhouses demanded a third fleet, larger than the second, because the Vorn could not conceive of a problem that was not a problem of insufficient force, but the other delegations had begun, quietly, to do a thing they had never done in the presence of the Cullhouses, which was to count. If 100 ships had vanished, what would 200 do but vanish more expensively? And if the human fleet could fold the escape shut on the largest harvest force in 2 centuries, then where exactly was safe? The delegations near the dust wall had started to wonder whether the wall might open over their worlds next, and whether the thing that came through it would be as merciful to them as it had apparently been to the 100 ships it took whole. Fear is a solvent. It had taken 80 years, but the contempt that held the Concorde together had finally met something it could not dissolve, and so the contempt began, instead, to dissolve. While they argued, the dust wall opened over the Concorde itself. It had never done this. The Aldgate worlds had been content, for 80 years, to be left alone, to grow in the dark, to defend their own. They came to the Concord now for one reason only, which was that a power which harvests will not stop being told no by mail. It has to be shown. So the Aldgate fleet folded out of empty space above the chamber of pale stone, 300 dark hulls where the charts swore nothing could be, and at their head came the Banished, and on the bridge of the Banished stood a woman who was 141 years old and had waited a very long time to come home to the room that threw her people away. Tamsin Crow did not fire. She had not fired at Wend, and she did not fire now. The Aldgate fleet simply hung above the great chamber, 300 hulls no Concord weapon could scratch, blotting out the light, and the message of it needed no band at all. But Tamsin Crow opened a band anyway, every band, the way she had over Wend, because she wanted the whole Concord to hear what she had come to say. 80 years ago you banished my people, she said. You did it in 6 minutes. You sealed it in less than a second. You told us we were unfit to sit among civilized peoples, too young and too loud and too willing to fight. And then, you sent your hunters to harvest the worlds that took our flag, because you were certain a banished people builds nothing. We built this. She let them look at the 300 hulls. She let them count, and stop counting, the way HFY had. We did not come to harvest you, she said. We do not harvest. That is the line between us, and it always was, and you drew it yourselves the day you signed the first writ. We came to tell you that the writ is over, every writ. The cull houses are ended. The Vorn will sign no more contracts, because the Vorn have no more fleet, because their largest fleet in 200 years is in our keeping, alive, every soul of it, learning what mercy is. The harvest is finished. The 40,000 worlds you governed by the threat of the long gray ships are no longer governed by it, because the long gray ships answer to us now, and we will never use them, and the threat that held your Concord together for 900 years is gone. The chamber was silent. 400 delegations, who had built their order on the harvest, on the quiet certainty that troublesome worlds could always be corrected, sat under 300 hulls and understood, all at once, that the foundation had been taken out from under them while they were busy laughing. You are not being conquered, Tamsin Crow said, and her voice in the great chamber was the same plain voice that had passed sentence on HFY. We do not want your seats. We do not want your votes. We do not want your worlds. We want one thing, and you are going to give it, because you cannot stop us, and because for the first time in 900 years, you are dealing with a power that is stronger than you, and will not become you. You are going to let the worlds go. Every world that wants to leave your Concord may leave it. Every world that wants our flag may have it. Every world that wants to stand alone may stand, and if your hunters ever come for it, we will come too, and we will not send your hunters home a second time. There was one more thing Tamsin Crow did in the Chamber of Pale Stone, and the freed worlds remembered it longer than the fleet. She had brought a passenger on the Banished, an old woman, the oldest human alive, who had not spoken in public for 80 years. The Aldgate worlds had kept her quiet and safe at the forge across the long dark, because she was the one who had walked out of that chamber under 400 sets of eyes, and they had wanted her to walk back in. Edra Vance was very old now, older than Tamsin Crow, kept alive by the long life of the forge, and by a stubbornness that the council said had outlasted 3 generations of younger people. She came onto the floor of the chamber she had been expelled from, slowly, on the arm of a young crew officer who had grown up on the story of her 7 words, and she stood in the place where she had stood 80 years before, and she looked up at the 400 delegations who had laughed, or whose grandparents had laughed, and she did not laugh, and she did not weep, and she said only this. You told us we would build nothing. I came back to see whether you would like to apologize. I see that you would not. That is fine. We did not come for an apology. We came for the worlds. Keep your seats. We are taking the worlds. Then she turned, exactly as she had 80 years before, and she walked the length of the chamber, and at the door she turned once more, the way she had, and she spoke the other half of the 7 words she had left them with, the half no one had understood at the time. We remembered which of you smiled. We have not come to make you cry. We have come to make you free, and we did not ask whether you wanted it, because the harvested never get asked, and now you will know how that feels. That was the Empire. Not the 300 hulls. Though the hulls made it possible. The Empire was the offer. The thing the Concord had never once made to anyone in 900 years. The right to leave. The Aldgate worlds had been thrown into the dark against their will. And out of that wrong, they had built the one thing the galaxy had never had, which was a power large enough to break the harvest, and decent enough to let the broken go free instead of collecting them. The worlds left. Not all at once, but steadily, world after world, choosing the dark binary's flag, or its own flag, or simply the open lane, and the Concord could not stop them, because the thing that had kept them in line was gone, folded down to Aldgate, learning mercy. The first to leave was Wend, of course, though Wend had never really belonged to the Concord, having taken the human flag years before. After Wend came Isen's daughter colonies, the world settled by the few who had escaped the cull 2 centuries past, and they did not so much leave as finally exhale, having waited 200 years to be told that the thing that murdered their grandparents would not come again. After Isen came the moons of Tarak, and after Tarak 100 small worlds that no one in the Chamber of Pale Stone had ever bothered to learn the names of, and that was the point, that the unlearned worlds, the tonnage worlds, the worlds the Concord had governed by threat and counted by yield, were now choosing for themselves, and the choosing could not be stopped because the thing that stopped choosing was gone. The settled stars did not fall in fire. The Aldgate worlds would not allow it to fall in fire, which surprised everyone, including the freed worlds, some of whom wanted very much to see the Chamber of Pale Stone burn. Tamsin Crow refused them. A burning, she said, was just a harvest you happened to approve of, and the moment the Aldgate worlds started approving of harvests, they would be the cull houses with a better flag. So the Concord did not fall. It unwound, slowly, into the thing it had refused to allow, which was a galaxy of worlds that could say no, and the Aldgate worlds watched over all of it, and harvested none of it, and kept every promise they had ever made. Tamsin Crow lived to see 11,000 worlds become 40,000. She lived to see the cull houses become a memory that mothers used to frighten children, and then a memory that no longer frightened anyone. She lived to see the dust wall opened so often, by so many grateful hulls coming and going, that the charts finally gave up and drew a door, where the door had always secretly been. She did not rule any of it. That was the thing the freed worlds found hardest to believe, and the thing that, more than the fleet, finally convinced them the Aldgate worlds were not a new Concord wearing a kinder mask. The most powerful person in the galaxy was a shipwright, who lived at the forge between 2 dead stars, and held no title at all. The freed worlds offered her every title there was, because that was what power was supposed to want, and they did not know how to deal with a power that did not want it. She turned it all down. She had not spent 80 years breaking one chamber of pale stone in order to build herself another. What she built instead had no name for a long time, because it was not really a government. It was a promise, the same promise that had been carried to Wend in a gray stone, extended now to every world that wanted it. Take this flag, and if the longships ever come, we come too. That was the whole of the Aldgate Empire, an empire that governed nothing and protected everything, and it held together not by force, though the force was real, but by the simple fact that in 80 years, and then 100, and then 200, the Aldgate worlds had never once broken the promise, and a promise kept that long becomes something stronger than any law. She died at 160, on the bridge of the Banished, which had become less a warship than a thing the freed worlds sent their children to see, because it was the ship that came home to the chamber and gave the harvest back its no. She had laid the first keel with cold hands and the last plate with old ones, and in between she had built, out of a banishment meant to kill her people, an empire that governed by the one law the Concord never understood, which was that the strong are only worth anything when they refuse to be the worst. In her last years, she did one thing more, and it was the thing that turned an empire into a way of living. She refused to let the Aldgate worlds forget that they had been the harvested. She built at the forge a long hall, and on its walls she had carved the names of the dead worlds, the ones the Vorn had culled across 3,000 years, Isen and Tarak, and 900 others, every name the human archives had recovered, so that the children of Aldgate would walk past them every day and know exactly what the fleet was for and exactly what it must never become. A power that forgets it was once the prey, she told the council, is just a predator waiting for an excuse. So she made forgetting impossible. She made the dead a wall, and the wall a teacher, and the teaching was the only law the Aldgate worlds ever truly had. The freed worlds sent their own dead to be added to the wall, and in time the long hall at the forge became the nearest thing the galaxy had to a sacred place. Not because anything holy had happened there, but because it was the one place where the strongest power in the void had chosen, deliberately and forever, to remember being weak. They buried her at the forge, between the two dead stars, in the cold yard where she had laid the first keel, 80 years before the day she came home. The freed world sent 10,000 small lights to hang in the dark above her, one for every world that could now say no, and the lights are still there, and the Aldgate fleet still keeps its watch, and the dust wall still opens for anyone who calls. On a wall at Aldgate, in human hands, is carved the thing HFY said in the chamber on the gray afternoon, the 8 words that started it all. A banished people builds nothing, they only run. Underneath it, in larger letters, is the answer the galaxy spent 80 years learning, and it is not a boast, because the Aldgate worlds never learned to boast. It is just the truth, set down plain, the way Tamsin Crow set everything down. We did not run, we built, and we came back for you all. The galaxy that came after the Concorde did not look like the Concorde, and that was the whole of the point. There was no writ, and no permission to correct a world, and no long gray ships that came when a population grew inconvenient. There was, instead, a loose and stubborn scattering of free worlds, 40,000 of them and growing, each governing itself, each carrying somewhere a gray stone it hoped never to break, and the certain knowledge that if it broke it, someone would come. It was not tidy. The Concorde had prized tidiness above all things, had culled the moons of Tarak for the crime of being too many. The galaxy after it was loud, and various, and full of worlds that disagreed with one another, and it was free, and the Aldgate worlds had decided, long ago, that free and loud was worth more than tidy and silent, and they kept the watch that made the choice possible, and asked nothing in return but that the wall of names be remembered. The Vorn who surrendered live at Aldgate still, the old ones dying off, the young ones raising children who have never harvested anything, and never will. The Cull Houses, as an institution, simply ended, not with a battle, but with a generation, as the young Vorn raised at the forge grew up and had children of their own, and the very idea of the harvest became a thing their grandparents had done in a darkness no one could quite remember the reason for. There was no last great Vorn fleet to be defeated. There was only a people slowly forgetting how to be predators, in the keeping of the people they had tried to harvest, which the Aldgate world said was the only kind of ending that ever truly held. HFY lived to be very old, in the mercy he was given and never gave, and they say that near the end, he asked to be brought to the wall, and that he read the 8 words he had spoken, and the answer beneath them, and that he was quiet for a long time. And then the oldest hunter the Vorn ever had, the one who laughed in the chamber, the one who said a banished people builds nothing, said the only thing left for him to say, the thing the whole galaxy had learned the hard way, in the dark, behind a wall, from a shipwright with cold hands who had decided, 80 years before, to disagree. He said, I was wrong about the nothing. And the green world of Wend, 8,000 farmers at the end of a thin lane, brought in its harvest that autumn, under a quiet sky, and the next year, and the next, and never once set out a gray stone again, because the promise had been kept, and the worst day had come, and someone had come too, and the long gray ships never darkened that sky, or any sky again. That is the whole of it. They banished a people for being too young to matter, and too loud to govern, and too willing to fight. And in the dark they had thrown that people into, the people built not just a fleet, but an empire, and the empire came back, and it did not harvest the ones who threw it away. It simply opened the door they had nailed shut on 40,000 worlds, and held it, and let everyone go free. Children at Aldgate are taught the story plainly, the way the Aldgate worlds teach everything. They are walked along the wall of names, the dead worlds and the answered worlds, and they are told that once their people sat in a great chamber and were laughed at and thrown into the dark to die. They are told that the people did not die. They are told that they did not become hunters, though it would have been easy, though the dead in the wall would have understood. They are told that the people built in the cold, with nothing but their archives and their stubbornness and their refusal to be what was done to them, a fleet that no beam could scratch and a door that no lock could hold, and that they carried the door to 40,000 worlds and opened it and held it and asked nothing. And then the children are told the part that matters most, the part Tamsin Crow insisted on, the only lesson the Aldgate worlds ever required their young to learn. They are told that strength is the easy half. Anyone can become strong, given 80 years and a wall to hide behind, and enough reason to want it. The hard half, the half almost no power in the history of the void has ever managed, is to become strong and stay decent, to hold the beam that ended 90 billion souls and choose, with it in your hand, not to be the thing that fired it. That is the whole of what the Aldgate worlds were, not the fleet. The choice the fleet made possible, made again and again, every day, for 800 years and counting. The choice to be the strongest thing in the dark and the gentlest, both at once, on purpose, forever. The Concorde laughed for 6 minutes once. The galaxy has been free for 800 years. It still keeps the better deal.